For this project, I will be building a red oak gun cabinet. Although the measurements are different, I based my design off my grandfather's gun cabinet. Here are the rough dimensions of the cabinet. As mentioned, I didn't follow these. So I ended up going to Lowe's, picked up some finished red oak plywood, as well as some brass hardware to accent the walnut stain. Grabbed some zinc screws to use as fasteners, and it was time to get started. I rounded up the measurements to get more out of the wood. Here I'm scoring the cut lines to prevent any splintering when I run the saw. Unfortunately, my mic overheated and stopped working for these next few clips. And here's the result of the scored lines. I figured it'd be a lot easier to work with if I cut the entire board in half. The audio is fixed after this clip, by the way. Here I'm cutting out the rest of the wall outline. And for now, the walls are done. I decided on doing dado cuts, and here I'm measuring the thickness that will be the top bench that the guns rest on. So I'll mark the width of the dado cut, draw a line, and then I score it with a utility knife. Then I set my blade depth to about half the thickness of the board. And pretty much just cut along the inside of the dado line. After I used a 1/2-inch straight bit to route out the middle channel. I used the same straight edges to set up a fence for the router. I set the depth to remove 1 layer of material per pass. I made the initial circular saw cuts to avoid any splintering that may be caused by the router. Then I removed any leftover material with a chisel that was way too dull. I ended up picking up a new one later on in the video. I tested the fit with a piece of scrap wood and it fit perfectly. Nice and snug. So then I repeated these steps with the other wall. And it's time to cut the shelf. So here I'm just testing the fit for the walls and the shelf. And it fit really well. Everything squared up nicely. I checked it with a speed square. But there was one problem. There was way too much depth for my liking. 16 inches is very deep for a gun cabinet. So I decided to rip 2 inches off each board to hopefully fix that issue. And there's my first mistake. So I forgot to clamp the start of the cut, and because I was hanging off the edge of the table, the weight of the board fell and it took some of the bottom off of the other piece. And there's a close-up of the break. But fortunately it was a clean break, so I was able to cut it and attempt to fix it. So I just used some Titebond 3 to glue it back together. And I used a clamp that was way too small, but all my other clamps were in use, so I'll swap it out once I'm done. So I'm not gonna make that mistake again. And much cleaner cuts now. So here I'm just testing the fit and check the new depth, make sure it fits a little bit better. And I was a lot happier with this new depth. And yeah, I did. I swapped to a larger clamp. So the next morning I used my dull chisel to clean up the repair. Just make sure everything turned out pretty well. So here I'm measuring for the back, which is I'm taking the width of the shelf as well as the base channel of the dado cuts. And I'm adding that together to get the rough width of the back. Each of these cuts I gave myself a little bit more to play with just in case I messed anything up. And here's my homemade track saw. Or track for my circular saw, I guess you should say. I ended up borrowing some Carson corner clamps from my dad. That way I could put all of it together and make sure it's still squared up and just get an idea for how big this thing's going to be. Everything fit really well, but unfortunately the bottom opening was huge. So I decided to make a small shelf. I decided to do dado cuts on these to help support the weight of ammo cans. And here I'm just using some more straight edges for a fence for the router. Squaring everything up with the chisel. And the test fit had some play, but I figured the glue and fasteners would help tighten things up. So I went ahead and just repeated this for the other board as well. Then I sanded down the inside with 120 grit, just to make a little less work for when I assemble this thing. I don't have to worry about getting into all the tight corners after I put it together. This saved me a little bit of sanding. I still had to sand the whole thing, but this saved me some time. And that corner repair actually didn't turn out too bad, so thankfully I was able to fix that. Here I'm just pre-drilling some holes for the fastener. Using this MilesCraft jig to keep the holes as straight as possible. And here's what they look like on the outside. I then countersank all the holes. And glued up the edges of the board, still with Titebond 3. And yeah, I probably should have used a glue brush for this part. Then hand tightened all the fasteners in place. I could have used an impact, but to be honest, I didn't want to accidentally blow through the board. And so here I'm just doing the same thing, but with the top shelf. And at this time, I didn't have long enough clamps, so I just used a ratchet strap to hold it together. Countersinking these and attaching the fasteners the same way I did the bottom shelf. And then I started cutting a piece for the top of the cabinet. And here I just measure how far in I need to make my screw marks on the top. And then transferred that depth to the top of the board. So after this, I made another trip to Lowe's. I grabbed another finished sheet as well as some solid red oak for the trim of the cabinet. When I put this together, I left an overhang for the back to help stabilize the cabinet. And then I marked every 4 inches for the brad nailer on the back. Here I used 2-inch 18 gauge nails for the back. The end result looked awesome. It turned out perfect. No blowouts or anything. That is until I realized I put the board on backwards. When laying it out, I really wanted the start grain to be on the back. Instead of redoing it, I crossed my fingers hoping the stain would hide it. But very happy with the size of the cabinet so far. Now to cut a piece for the bottom. And here I'm just countersinking the holes for the top. And then I decided to cut out some plugs with the same material to help hide the screws. Cut them in half to fit the countersink holes a little bit better too. Here I'm adding a little bit of glue to each of the screw holes and then putting the plugs in place and making sure the grain direction lines up. And the grain direction did. It lined up perfectly. Well, I mean, that is until I chiseled them flush. Yep. Should have used solid red oak for the plugs. I'll redo these if the stain makes them stand out. In the meantime, I ripped these boards in half on the table saw, which I forgot to record. It was actually cheaper to buy and rip the wider boards than to buy the pre-cut width I needed for the trim. I gave the trim a 1/4 inch reveal. And thanks, Dad, for letting me use your guide blocks. I'm very happy with how the first piece turned out. I'll do this for the rest of the cabinet as well. The remainder of this side turned out great, but I had my first nail blowout. I wrestled with trying to get this nail out, but unfortunately I was destroying the wood. So I decided to just cut it with a multi-tool and hammer the wood flat again. I'll refasten this piece next time I can lay the cabinet flat. I finished adding trim to the face of the cabinet and measured for a piece to catch the bottom of the doors. It fit perfectly. So I glued it, nailed it into place. All that's left is the top miter piece. The next day I decided to give Lowe's some more money. I actually thought of a better idea for the top shelf of the cabinet. I just wish I didn't glue this piece on, because now I gotta remove it. I carefully removed the trim on the top and then scored the wood around the board I'd glued down to help minimize the amount of splintering when I take it off. Unfortunately, it still splintered quite a bit. But my idea was to glue up some solid oak boards to give the top a cleaner look. So I measured for the depth of the trim notch, made my marks, and then made the first cut with a jigsaw. It was actually easier for me to do this in 2 cuts as opposed to working with a bunch of measurements. And it actually fit perfectly. And it was even flush with the outside trim, so I guess 2 cuts it is. So I went ahead and did the exact same thing to the other edge piece. And unfortunately my math was a little off and I had about an inch gap. So I decided to space them apart with 3 equal sized gaps to help hide it. I ended up just ripping the boards I had, and that looks a lot better. So here I'm just drilling out some 1/4 inch dowel holes for the glue up. Thanks to my dad again for letting me use his MilesCraft jig. And I brought them inside. Unfortunately, I was a little off with the hole placements though. When I put them together, they didn't line up as perfect as I thought they would. So this board is going to be supported by that piece of plywood underneath, so I figured it wouldn't be a big deal to glue it up without the dowels. And for this step, I ended up buying some longer clamps. Again, I did this inside mainly because I didn't want the humidity to affect the glue up. And then while that dried, I went back out and ended up finishing fastening the trim. After this, I started adding trim to cover up the open grain of the finished plywood, using some 1/4 inch thick solid red oak pieces I grabbed from Lowe's. And then pretty much just wrapped up all the trim, except for the longer edges of the walls. I'll have to stand the cabinet upright for these edges. Unfortunately, I couldn't find trim long enough for these edges, so I did it with 3 pieces. I'll do my best to hide the seams when I start sanding. I decided to start working on the bottom cabinet doors, and with a little bit of weird backwards math, I got everything measured out. I used miter joints for the doors to create a stronger, more durable bond. I laid out the door shape and just double checked all the measurements and made sure everything was square. And then once it was, I cut the pieces for the second door. I put together a rough jig for routing out the edges for the acrylic paints to lie on. And it didn't work out too well. I was focusing on holding the trim more than the router itself, so I decided to hold the trim in place with another board and some clamps. This made it much easier. I'm hoping this mistake isn't too noticeable once I've made the final cuts. Continued routing, removing little by little with each pass, until the notch was flush with the thickness of the acrylic. I repeated this process off camera for the other door. If this mistake was any bigger, I probably would have redone this piece. Now that the glue up was dry, I brought it into the garage to chisel and sand and get all these obnoxious stickers off the boards. I started with a more aggressive 120 grit to help make the surface more even and level. Other than a few spots here and there, this did the trick. The higher grit would take care of these minor spots. So then I switched over to the Gator 220 grit paper to finish the surface. I wanted the grain to have a nice texture, so I didn't go any higher than 220 on this board. After sanding, I chamfered all the under edges to make installing this board a lot smoother. Here I'm just being very careful, hammering it in, and then using my hands to press the final bits in. And it fit like a glove. These gaps along the edges will be covered by the smaller trim on the inside, so I'm not too worried about them. Moving back to the doors, I wasn't a big fan of all the burring along the grooves. So I ended up wrapping a piece of wood with 220 grit paper and sanded down all the grooves the acrylic would rest in. This did the trick, but unfortunately there was still a little bit of splintering along the edges, so I decided to go back through and just using the weight of the wood very lightly sand all the edges. And after sanding the doors, I switched gears back to the cabinet. And here I'm squaring up the edge of the shelf, giving myself a 1-inch overhang. And then very, very lightly sanded the edges as well to help avoid splintering. I actually read online that it isn't a good idea to glue hardwood to plywood due to humidity expansion, so it's probably a good thing I removed that first board to begin with. But here I glued it up and fastened it down with 2-inch brad nails. After some more backwards math, I figured out the dimensions for the top doors. I ended up with the same width as the bottom door, so I guess my math was somewhat accurate. After cutting all the pieces for the top doors, I used the same router method for cutting the acrylic grooves. The longer pieces I just ended up doing in smaller sections. Then I sanded all the grooves and edges, just like I did with the smaller bottom doors. I'm limited on workspace, so I waited to glue the doors until the very end of the day. And that's pretty much why I didn't glue them up immediately and switch back to working on the cabinet. I actually picked up these Jorgenson strap clamps from Lowe's for gluing the door trim together, and they worked out amazingly. The next day the glue was dry, and it was time to start sanding the doors. Looking back, I probably should have spent a little more time sanding the miter joints, but for now they looked pretty good. I then took some measurements for the trim and framed up the inside of the cabinet. Due to how thin these pieces of trim were, I switched over to a pin nailer to avoid cracking the trim. Here I'm using 1-inch fasteners to hold in the molding. The bottom turned out great, so now it's time to move on to the top. For the top, I just trimmed out the walls and the back. I didn't worry about the front because that's where I was going to be mounting my light bars. And now that it was the end of the day, it was time to glue up the top doors. This one board was slightly warped, so I ended up using a clamp to hold the joint flush while it dried. They'll definitely need some sanding, but they turned out nice and square. I hung them up with clamps to double check the reveals and the amount of overhang that I wanted. And then it all looked good, so I sanded the larger doors at 120 and then 220 grit. And then I went through and hand sanded all the trim at 220 grit. For the hand sanding, I just wrapped 120 grit around a piece of cork, and this took a long time. I went back and cleaned up all the dust with the shop vac. Now it was time to move on to the feet of the cabinet. For this, I used 3-inch segments of extra door frame material and cut 16 equal size pieces. Each foot would be made up of 4 glued up segments. I let these pieces sit overnight. And here they are the next day. They turned out pretty good. So I ended up using a belt sander to square up all the feet. Then I traced out the shape I had in mind for the feet. I made the first 2 cuts on the miter saw, but didn't want to work on a miter saw with angles, so I ended up using the disc sander for the other sides. And this took a long time. Finally had all the feet finished up. Now it was time to clean them up with some more sanding. The belt sander was a more aggressive grit, so for the hand sanding I used 220 grit. Then I added a very slight chamfer to all the edges of the feet, again to prevent any possible splintering. And then with the feet done, it was time to move on to cutting out the acrylic. So I measured up the doors, made my marks, and I'm not sure if scoring makes a difference for acrylic. It's more just a force of habit. These pieces fit very well, although some of them had a slight bow to them, but I wanted to see how the wood reacted to the inside humidity before I make any adjustments to the acrylic. So here all the acrylic pieces are cut to fit. I ordered 10 soft close 1/4-inch overlay hinges for all the doors. This was my first time using this style of hinge, so this will be interesting. I measured the center mark 3 inches from the bottom and top of the smaller doors. Then used this guide I picked up to mark the screw holes. Not too bad. A little off, but fortunately they can adjust. Here I'm making guidelines for the overlap to help mark the hinge mounting points. I hand tightened a lot of the hardware for this cabinet. I was paranoid about blowouts and stripping any of the holes. And almost. I'll make the hinge adjustments once the cabinet's inside. A level ground would make things a lot easier for making any adjustments. I did some research online and saw that doors over 40 inches should have 3 hinges in them. So I made the same 3-inch cuts from the top and bottom and then added one in the middle. The hinges worked out pretty well, and I am a big fan of the silent close, even if they do take forever to close. The gaps between the doors were not perfect, but I wanted to see if having the cabinet on a flat surface as well as the humidity change would bring them together more. Now to make the shelf the barrels will rest on. For this, I glued up 2 more pieces of leftover oak for the doors. I bought way too much. I did, however, buy a glue brush instead of using popsicle sticks or my fingers. I didn't bother joining these boards with dowels since the shelf wouldn't be bearing any weight. It would just be supporting the firearms upright. I did end up using the popsicle sticks, however, to prevent gluing the clamps to the boards. While this dried, I figured it'd be a good time to test out the stains. I used Minwax conditioner for a more even stain and tested each type of wood I used for the cabinet. I went with a dark walnut stain to really make the grain pop. I really like how the grain pops, but I don't think the brass hardware will match really well. So I ended up going back to Lowe's and I grabbed some black padding as well as black hardware. I like the black more. It's not as distracting and it helps the darker grains pop a bit. So I ended up cutting the liner to fit all the shelves. And then after the stain cured, I added 2 coats of poly ultra flat and lightly sanded between coats. And this was the result. The next day, the glue for the shelf had dried and was ready to sand. I measured out locations for the barrel notches and then used a cap to trace the cutouts. I then cut out each of the notches with a jigsaw and sanded the notches with 80 grit paper wrapped around a dowel. Unfortunately, the notches were a little sloppy and uneven, so I went back through and cleaned them up with a small file. Since the garage floor wasn't level, I ended up using a wooden block to square the shelf to the top of the cabinet. And then I tested the height of my tallest and shortest barrels. Now that the height was ideal, I made sure everything was square and traced a guideline for the shelf. I then measured and drilled 3 pilot holes evenly spaced across, then countersank and screwed the shelf from the back. I'm leaving these screws uncovered. That way, as I acquire more guns, I could just make a new shelf with more notches to put in. Once the shelf was done, my dad and I set up a staining area inside a storage room inside. With everything inside, I waited a couple days for the wood to adjust to the humidity and temperature change. Before staining, I went through and filled all the nail holes with wood filler. I also filled in any small cracks or imperfections I saw in the wood. While the wood filler dried, I began measuring and mounting the feet. The different attachments on this drill allowed for me to get right up against the cabinet walls. I positioned the feet to overlap the wall panels to avoid the walls settling over time and to help bear more of the weight. Then I made sure my math was correct and that the hole marked the center of the foot. And it did. Then I drilled the rest of the holes and then figured out how deep these screws would go into the feet. So I measured the screw and then subtracted the 3/4 inch thickness of the bottom board, which gave me about 1 inch. So then I set up a drill stop for pre-drilling the foot holes. Then I countersank all the holes and attached the feet. Now that the filler had dried, I decided to sand with a 120 grit sponge to allow for more even sanding on uneven spots like the trim and molding. I sanded everything in preparation for staining. After I went through with a tack cloth to pick up any loose dust from sanding. Now it's time for the conditioner, so I bought a little bit more of it. To apply the conditioner, I used a staining sponge to allow for a more even coat. I just had to be careful and make sure it didn't run or pool up anywhere. I let this sit for about 15 minutes. I am loving how the grain is popping already. I decided to give this stain pad a try for applying the stain. All the angles and different surfaces made it nearly impossible to not get stain all over myself. After 15 minutes, I wiped the stain off with a paper towel. And the grain looked absolutely amazing. By this point, I was too excited by the result of the bottom compartment to not stain the rest of the cabinet. Looking back, I probably should have sanded a bit more on the glue-ups and nail holes. "15 minutes had passed and I began wiping off the stain. Wiping away the stain and seeing the grain detail was probably one of the most rewarding moments of this build for me. Thank God we put this cabinet on a creeper and I could rotate it as I stain. While the stain cured on the front, I applied the conditioner and stain to the rest of the cabinet. I let the conditioner sit for about 15 minutes before applying the stain. Throughout this process, I would also check the rest of the cabinet for any runny spots or drips of stain to wipe off. I got a bit too excited and started prepping and staining the doors. Looking back, I definitely should have drilled out the mounting points for the locks and hardware before staining the doors. My excitement after seeing the result of the cabinet definitely got the best of me here. It also probably wouldn't have hurt to sand the joints a little bit more here, but I had tunnel vision. I had seen the result of the cabinet, and I don't think anything was going to stop me from staining these doors. I just wanted to see how it looked. So here I put stain on one side at a time. Almost knocked everything over. And then wiped it all off after 15 minutes. After the fronts had time to sit and weren't tacky anymore, I decided to stain the backs. These were tricky with making sure the stain didn't run or pool up along the cutouts and hinge holes. Now that both sides were stained, I went through and stained all the edges. The next day, I conditioned and stained the top and the feet. The grain detail on the top is probably some of my favorite. It's just too bad no one's going to see it. While I let the stain cure for a few days, I began fitting the hardware to the doors. My original idea for the backboard was to use a 1/4-inch piece of hardwood. Unfortunately, this wouldn't work out well with the latch mechanisms I picked out. And to be honest, I really didn't want to change the latches. I really liked the look of them. However, a 3/4-inch thickness piece would give me the perfect amount of depth to use the latches. And that way I could also notch them out and make an insert for the locks to fall into. So I gave Lowe's some more of my money and got some more 3/4-inch hardwood. Here I'm sanding the surfaces clean and giving the edges a very slight chamfer. Running a tack cloth to pick up any dust. Then I condition and stain these boards following the same routine as the cabinet. Again, I definitely should have gotten this all figured out before staining the doors. While the stain cured, I went out into the garage and made a jig to outline the hole placement for the top and bottom hardware. Since I had already made the adjustments to the hinges, I numbered each one as I removed them so I wouldn't get them mixed up. And then some more backwards math to find the center position for the jig. For the lock holes, I ended up using a small Forstner bit. That way it just creates a cleaner cut hole. And then I filed the edges to match the outline shape. After I did the second door, and measured from the wrong side. Yay. I made the corrections and got the handle mounted in the correct spot. Ended up using some stainable wood filler to hopefully hide the holes. I repeated this process for the top doors, not making the same mistake twice. There are a few spots that need more sanding and touch-ups. These spots are from the glue-ups, and I should have sanded these joints a little bit more. So I hand sanded them with 220 grit. Then I applied the stain in the direction of the wood grain. Fortunately, the stain blended very well together and fixed these for the most part. I let the touch-ups sit for a day, then decided to start sealing the cabinet. I'm using a warm ultra-flat Mimwax polyurethane in case you're wondering. To apply this, I used a 2-inch and 3-inch brush, applying in the direction of the grain. I also applied a coat to the doors and backboards. I let this sit and dry for over 24 hours. Before I apply the second coat, I will lightly sand the entire surface with this 320 grit sponge. Then I applied the second coat of polyurethane. Did it to the doors as well. The next day I laid out all the mats and reinstalled the doors and hardware just to make sure everything looked good and matched. Now it was time to make the lock cutouts for the backboards. Again, should have done this before staining everything. I closed the door and then turned the lock to mark the area the latch would sit in. I then measured and scored the cut lines, marked the appropriate depth with a drill stop. I used a punch here so the drill wouldn't walk. And then I pretty much drilled multiple holes within the cut line. After, I used a chisel to square up the hole and remove the material between the drill holes. Then I filed the edges smooth. The latch fit perfectly. Now it's time to mount the board to the door. I used some painter's tape to make the guideline for the board. To mount it, I ended up using construction grade glue sticks to create a fast bond. That way I can hold it in place until I nail it. Last time I'll say it, but I should have just glued these with Titebond before staining. I also should have double checked everything. Can you see the mistake? Spoiler alert, board is on backwards. Oblivious to the mistake, I used some clamps to apply even pressure across the board. Realization in 3, 2, 1. Oh, where's the latch hole? Yep, wrong side. Yeah. So I very carefully pried the boards apart. And then I scraped off the glue residue with the plastic end of the glue brush. Don't let my smile fool you. This took a while and really sucked. Finally got it all off and was able to pull the pin nails through the board. Let's try this again. And the second time was a charm. Time to take a breather before I mess anything else up. After a short break, I came back and drilled the hardware holes to the reveal board. I ended up picking up some 2-inch screws that were the same thread pitch as the ones that came with the handles. Then I mounted the hardware. Now it was time to mount the deadbolt latch. Apologies for the camera angle. This was a tough shot to film. I ended up marking the screw holes for the catch and pre-drilled the holes. Then I did the same for the bolt. I understand this is not the most secure locking mechanism out there. This is more of a decorative display cabinet than an actual gun safe. After the top doors were complete, I moved on to the bottom left door. Again, doing the same method I did for the top door. Learning from my mistake on the top door, I triple checked that the board was oriented correctly. There was too much overlap on the bottom. There was still some on the top, but it wasn't as bad. I decided to mount it on the top because it would also require less squatting when opening the doors. The deadbolt worked, but was mounted a little crooked. I will go back and fix this later, but for now, my Amazon order arrived. I ordered some very thin light bars, some black felt fabric for the barrels to rest on, some brown cable concealers for the light bar power cord. I cut a thin strip of the fabric and used hot glue to mount it to the shelf. If the fabric were to become frayed or damaged over time, I wanted the option to be able to replace it without damaging the shelf. That's why I used the hot glue for this step. I originally was going to use the same padding material as I used for the bottom shelves, but after some research, I actually found out that padding can damage the bluing on barrels. After I shaved off the excess with a razor blade, and the gun shelf or gun rack, whatever you want to call this thing, was all done. Now it's time to mount the acrylic to the doors. I also use glue sticks for this because acrylic is prone to scratches and fogging over time, and I wanted the option to be able to replace the acrylic easily if needed. I'm sure there are better adhesive alternatives for this, so let me know in the comments if you know of a better solution than hot glue. Some more satisfying peels. There are a few spots here and there that I'll have to go back and remove some excess glue, but I think it turned out very nice. The power cord wasn't long enough, so I ended up stringing together the connector cables to get the ideal length. The light bar came with these 3M double-sided strips. The adhesion on them is actually pretty strong, so I'll just use these. First, I drilled a small hole to feed the power cable through. I did this in the top left corner where the hole would not be visible from. Then I staggered the double-sided strips along 2 of the light bars. Then I aligned and mounted them evenly across the inside lip of the top trim. This is where I was talking earlier. I didn't want to mount any trim. Ta! I didn't bother lighting the bottom due to the cleaner look with less wires. The concealers that wrapped around the top had to be cut at a 45 to wrap around the edge. It's not the cleanest, but it'll work. I probably should have drilled with a Forstner bit for a cleaner wire hole, but I didn't think it was the end of the world. I mean, no one's going to see it, except all the people watching this video. These wire concealers are very delicate and can break easily, so I ended up using these 3M strips to make replacing damaged ones easier in the future. I got lucky that the wire connector points fit perfectly in the concealers. I actually didn't account for this. I made sure to fold in some extra wiring. That way if the wiring becomes too snug, it will just pull out more instead of damaging them. At some point in the future, I will probably install a switch for the lights, but for now I'll just have to manually plug in and unplug the cord. I'm okay with that. I also ordered these magnets for mounting the pistols. They are very, very strong. Surprisingly strong, actually. I measured for a center point and then blocked the camera to mount them. Almost done. Just a couple steps left. Ended up picking up an assortment pack of felt pads to help reduce any rattle in the doors. I put these right above and below the backboards on the top and bottom doors. Then I ended up placing these rubber cushion pads on the bottom of the feet. And the cabinet is complete. I gotta say, I am very impressed with myself for pulling something like this off. This project in total took 2 months. Working just on the weekends, it took about 2 months to put together. And overall, I'm just very happy with how it turned out. To be honest, it was an awesome learning experience, and it forced me to take my time instead of rushing through a project. Even though I got a bit carried away with the staining portion, it still forced me to take my time. But please let me know in the comments if you have any pointers or advice for my next project. I mean, some things off the bat I definitely need to work on for future projects is having tighter and stronger butt joints. I noticed there was some play in it, and I don't know if that's because of the humidity change or what. But I also need to do some more research on different ways of applying and mounting acrylic. And then as mentioned before, spending a little more time on sanding and prep for cleaning up all the nail holes. Funny enough, the plugs for the screws turned out to be barely noticeable, so that actually worked out in the end. Had a hard time finding them on camera. Thank you all for watching. A full list of materials and tools used will be in the description of this video if you're interested or want to learn more. Please let me know what you think, as well as any advice you may have in the comments. And feel free to let me know if you have any cool project ideas I should try in a future video. Special thanks to my dad for helping me throughout this project too.